going to go ahead and get started. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Martha Durr this morning. She's a native of Nebraska. She serves as the state climatologist and is the associate professor of applied climate science in the School of Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska. She directs the Nebraska State Climate Office, which operates the Nebraska Mezzanette, a state weather monitoring program with 56 research grad observing stations across the state. Dr. Durr has degrees in meteorology, agricultural meteorology, and soil science. That is a mouthful. She joined UNL in 2009 and has 20 years of experience in the areas of applied climatology, weather and climate monitoring, impact assessment, and stakeholder engagement. Martha was one of the contributing authors on the 4th National Climate Assessment released in 2018. Her work has taken her to remote Alaska villages, but now she is glad to call Nebraska home. Please, if you will, let us welcome Dr. Durr. Thank you.
I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this morning. I'm really grateful. So I'm going to cover the topic of climate change, which is a really big and broad topic. I'll try and do it in the span of 40 minutes and leave some time for questions. And I'll also try and localize my comments to Nebraska specifically. So how many of you were aware that we had a state climate office in Nebraska? Good. So pretty much every state in the country does have a state climate office. We deal with issues related to past climate, present, kind of current and emerging climate issues like flood outlook, drought, when are we going to get out of this drought, those kinds of things. And increasingly we talk about climate change. I get lots of questions about climate change. We observe our environment, so Marcy mentioned the Nebraska Mezzanette, so I'll talk just briefly about that. We work a lot with stakeholders. We work with cities, natural resource districts, policymakers, state agencies, faith organizations, the public, the media, you name it, we've talked to them probably. Our goal is to help people use climate information to inform their decision making. So we try and match climate information with specific decisions that people are making, whether it's when do I plant my crops, when do I irrigate, how should I manage water resources, those kinds of decisions. So the Nebraska Mezzanette, everywhere you see a number on this map, that's where we have an observing station. In my intro slide, I had a picture of one of those stations, which was out in Arthur, Nebraska. My two favorite things to do in my job is engage with people like you and be out in the field helping to service those weather stations. This has been going since 1981. We're one of the longest standing state weather networks in the country. And actually there's a bill that was introduced to help fund this program. So I'm a huge supporter of that. So look for that. And voice your opinion if you wish. So I'm going to just talk very briefly about kind of how I think of the Earth climate system. I think of it in terms of our common home. So it's where we all live, and it's the climate system is very complex, so it can be hard to wrap your head around. But I think of it in these general terms. So it's composed of the atmosphere, the weather that we experience, the dynamics of the day-to-day, the landscape and everything that happens on the landscape, the changes that we make to the landscape influence the Earth climate system. The vast ocean, right? 70% of the Earth's surface is ocean. It's a big storage of heat, energy. It redistributes heat energy throughout the atmosphere. The frozen region, so I used to live and work in Fairbanks, Alaska for 7 years, so this was how I viewed the world. So we're looking at the North Pole view, a view that you probably don't typically think of. But the great refrigerators of Earth, those influence the climate system. And then people, we are a significant part of the Earth climate system. The decisions that we make or choose not to make that is a big influencer in the climate system. And all of this is connected, right? Everything is connected. We can't separate one thing out. We can look at one thing specifically, but we also have to look at how these parts are all connected to each other. So some climate change facts. I'm presenting them as facts. So climate change is real and here now. It's impacting all of us in different ways. Some populations it impacts much more strongly than others. There are certain populations that don't have the capacity to deal with the implications of climate change. So it's not just the polar bear on the ice floe. Climate change is the drought, the flood, going quickly from one extreme to another, the weather events that we feel, so we're all impacted by it. Climate change is thought of as a threat multiplier, right? So the U.S. Department of Defense looks very significantly at this idea of climate change because it amplifies national security issues, so they take it very seriously. So this can be thought of in many different aspects. We are the problem. It is because of us that the Earth's climate system is changing so dramatically right now. So we are the problem, but we're also the solution. I tell you, there is hope. I feel that there is hope. Connecting with people on common values to work through solutions is, that's where it's at. That's where we should be focusing our attention. So the actions that we choose right now matter a whole lot. So what we're seeing here is the Earth's temperature history in that black curve, and the future paths are illustrated in that, mostly that aqua curve and that orange curve. Those are our choices in terms of what we're creating for our climate future. So this is our current path. If we do not limit greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, so things like CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide is something that lives for about a century in the atmosphere. So choices we make now really matter in the long term. This RCP is representative concentration pathways. It just means how much greenhouse gases do we have in the atmosphere. That number, 8.5, that's a number of a watt per meter squared. So how much extra heat energy are we getting from all these greenhouse gases? So that's what these numbers mean. To me, this orange curve is not an option. Notice that it does not stabilize. We don't go into a stable climate. And that's not doable for us. High risk, catastrophic impacts, some of which we know, some of which we really don't know. So action now and within the next 10 years, now and in the next 10 years, that's where we follow this aqua curve here. There's much less risk with this scenario, and for most populations, much more manageable. We can adapt much better if we only warm a few degrees rather than 10 or 12 degrees Fahrenheit. So notice we have warmed about 1.5 degrees over the last century. In that red curve, that goes up to 8 or 10 degrees. Those are changes that no human has ever gone through or experienced. So we don't know all these implications. Okay. So the graph that I showed, it came from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So some of you may have heard of that group. So it's this international organization, a group of people who assess the state of the climate on a regular basis. The 6th assessment report came out a little over a year ago. And I got lots of questions of, what does this mean to you? When you read this, what does this mean to you? And this quote is what I think of. So it says, what's the use of having developed a science well enough to make predictions if in the end all we're willing to do is stand around and wait for them to come through? So So this was by, this wasn't me, it was by somebody accepting a Nobel Prize in his speech for chemistry of ozone. So to me, that's what this most recent report is.
How long ago did he say that?
This was in the 60s, I believe, 70s.
Okay.
It was a while ago, yeah, a few decades ago. Okay, so we have these predictions, we have these reports that come out on a regular basis. We have our roadmap. We know what's going to happen. We know that choices we make now do make a difference, so let's use them. Okay, so just a few comments about our climate in general that's maybe not related to climate change, but does influence kind of our decisions and so forth. You're looking at an average annual precipitation for the entire U.S. So notice just the color difference between right here in the Great Plains. So in Nebraska, here we get twice as much precipitation as they do out in Scottsbluff area, right? So we're in this really strong moisture gradient. It has nothing to do with climate change, it's just because we are in the middle of a continent. There's the dry Intermountain West, because our prevailing winds are from the west, and all that moisture in the atmosphere gets rained out in the Rocky Mountains. So it's dry in the west and it's wet in the east. We're very fortunate that we're the recharge region for the Ogallala Aquifer, right? Our groundwater resources are at a very different place than areas to our further south. So in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas Panhandle, they are in pretty dire conditions when it comes to water. We are not in such a shape here. We do have local control of groundwater resources, and we are the recharge region, which is a very good thing for us that we have. It's also pretty volatile weather conditions, right? We vary a lot. We have hailstorms, which have significant impacts. We have tornadoes, high winds, blizzards, all of this weather event that makes our climate really noisy and can almost confuse people into thinking, I don't know that there's climate change, because we always vary a lot. And that is true because of where we sit on the continent. But things are changing. Okay, so I just have a few bullet points to talk about where our climate history has been. Okay, temperatures are warmer now than what they've used to be. We've warmed by about 1.5 degrees, which is about the global average temperature, but the rate of warming is speeding up. Things are changing faster. We have trended toward wetter conditions, so the average statewide precipitation has increased by about 10%. Maybe that's not detectable, but we do get more heavy rainfall events. So when we get precipitation, it tends to be of higher amounts. We have drought, though, right? All of Nebraska is currently in drought condition. We've been dry for about 3 years. Some parts of the state drier than others. That is a normal part of our climate, just based on our general climate conditions. But that's going to be changing because of climate change. And extremes, hail events, tornadoes, heavy rain, those kinds of things are getting worse. Some people call it weather weirding, which I think is a really clever term. So those are amplifying. And the rate of change going from dry to wet and switching from one extreme to another, some call it weather whiplash, that tends to be amplifying. All right, so on the other slide, I showed the 2011 flood, which impacted a lot of eastern Nebraska, and then the 2012 drought. So it was a hot and dry year in 2012. Well, you all, I'm sure, remember the 2019 flood. And now the faucet got turned off. We've been dry for 3 years. So going from one extreme to another is a signature, a sign of climate change. So let's think about Nebraska's climate future. Okay, so my kids that are 8 and 10 now, when they're my age, middle of the century, when your children, grandchildren are your age, what is Nebraska's climate going to look like? Well, we'll keep on this theme of precipitation. So there's a lot of colors on this graphic, but what you're looking at is, this is our current climate. So 2020 here is right in the middle. So things on the right is our climate future, and the conditions on the left is our climate past, starting in about 1950. And this is going from January through December, so month to month, and then through time here. So the things that I wanted to point out is you see brown color here in the middle of the year. So during summer, we are likely to be drier than what we are now. So about 10 to 15% less precipitation during the growing season. And more of our precipitation will fall outside of the growing season. So November, kind of through March and April, that's projected to get wetter overall. Okay. In general, when we have a rain event, a snow event, it's going to be more of it at one time. So how we get our precipitation has a lot to do with the impacts that we feel, right? So I'm showing a picture from Omaha, I think it was August 7th in 2021, where there was flash flooding. I'm not saying that every event will result in this kind of impact, but in general, when we get precipitation, there's going to be more of it at one time. So more potential for flooding. If I was a city planner, I would be thinking of, how does our stormwater management look right now? Because it's going to be amplified in the future. If we can't deal with our current heavy rain events, we won't be able to in the future. Or if I was a producer, then I would be thinking about the potential for erosion kinds of events. So I would act to increase soil health, stabilize the soil, convert to maybe no-till or cover crops or decisions that is going to keep my soil stable, because this will be more common. The timing can really be everything for these big, large-scale events. So the flood of 2019, that disaster declaration was in place for lots of Nebraska. It wasn't just the storm event in March that caused this large-scale event. It was the fact that we had a cold end of winter. February was pretty cold. I think it was 7th coldest on record. We had a lot of snowpack. It was snowiest on record for Lincoln and Omaha. We had, most importantly, we had thick river ice, and we had frozen, saturated ground. So we've got lots of water sitting on the landscape in the form of snow and frozen ground. So when this storm came through and melted everything very quickly, there was nowhere for this water to go. So the timing of everything and the setup can really make a difference for these big impact events. There will be a greater likelihood for quickly going into drought conditions. This map was taken from the U.S. Drought Monitor. It's a change map. So where you see yellow, that's where we dried out last summer. So we're comparing what the state of the drought conditions in Nebraska were like middle of June to early September. We did have the third driest summer on record in Nebraska. Especially for the east, you can see conditions really dried out pretty quickly. So this idea of going into a drought quickly when it's hot and dry, or coming out of a drought. So I just talked about heavy rainfall events. So the rate, the speed at which we go from one extreme to another, we should expect that to amplify. So Nebraska's average annual temperature, we should plan for that warming by about 4 to 5 degrees. So that puts us in terms of present day southern Kansas. Okay? So I just, what's grown in southern Kansas? There's a wheat field there. So thinking about a month longer growing season, warmer temperatures, more days above 90 degrees, 100 degrees. Is our current cropping systems, what sort of impacts will we have? If those temperatures happen during when corn is pollinating, then that's not good for the crop. Or if it's that much warmer, there's going to be more demand for water. All these plants are going to be wanting more water. So evapotranspiration rates are going to go up overall. Okay, if I was in emergency management, if I worked for NEMA, let's say, or a community on a comprehensive plan, I would be thinking about extreme events happening outside of the window that we would normally expect them. So do you all remember this derecho, the high straight line wind that came through in December of 2021? So I happened to be on a Zoom at my house, and there was shingles that were falling off of my roof. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm distracted, I need to go. We had the warmest December on record that year. We had what's typically a midsummer storm event come through, and it spawned 30 tornadoes, 30. Previous to that, we had 3 tornadoes on record in Nebraska's history. Okay? So these kinds of events happening outside of traditional severe weather season, we should be thinking about and planning for that. We had a lot of fires last year. Much of the state was in drought, going into drought. We had high wind events. I got lots of questions and calls of what's going on with, why is it so windy here? This image is taken from April. So the Forest Service puts out this product of the potential, the risk for large wildland fire activity. So because we had been in dry conditions for a while, because the winds were high, because the seasonal climate outlooks were calling for a continuation of warm and dry conditions, then a lot of the western high plains were in this high risk for wildfire potential. There was loss of life because of this. I think there was about 220,000 acres that were burned in the state last year. The previous record was in 2012, a hot and dry year that burned about 500,000 acres. So again, if I worked for the fire service, I would be thinking, what sort of equipment do we need to mobilize and have in place for these large fire years? So also, if we are in a wet period, then that is probably going to promote a lot of growth, right? Grasses will be growing pretty strongly. And then we dry out. And then there's a lot of extra fuel that's there and ready to burn. Recent, I'm thinking the last few decades or so, trends that happen over shorter periods of time do matter, and we will still get cold, right? Just because we have a cold month, because we have a blizzard, that does not mean that we don't have climate change, okay? You can't say that a weather event is going to negate all of global climate change, which some people do. But in late winter, in February, this is from February of 2021, which the university was closed because of cold, not because of snow, but because of cold. We had rolling blackouts. This was taken from a newspaper article. This is down in Texas. So all across the Great Plains, there was impacts because of this winter storm and the cold. In late winter, we tend to be getting more cold air outbreaks. That is, in part, tied to climate change because the Arctic is warming much faster, 3 times faster than the rest of the world, in fact. When that happens, sometimes we'll get a wavy jet stream. When we get a wavy jet stream, then we'll get cold air that can filter into the mid-latitudes here. So it's a complicated linkage, but it is also tied to climate change. So we can still get cold and we can still have winter.
I have a question on a wavy jet stream.
Yeah.
Do you mean altitude wavy jet stream or wavy jet stream? To me, the jet stream stays, fairly the same altitude. But you're saying that no, it waves up and down. Is that
So
correct?
altitude wouldn't change necessarily, but thinking of going poleward to equatorward, so going
Okay, I see.
north
Yeah.
to south, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, wavy in terms of latitude. Okay, so extremes outside of Lincoln, outside of Nebraska, do matter. So the example that I'm showing here is the western half of the United States it's pretty clear that they are going to be more at risk for wildfires. It's going to be hotter, it's going to be drier in the Intermountain West. There's more potential for large wildfires to take place. So if your respiratory system is compromised, then you are feeling climate change. Okay, so something that happens outside of our local region does impact us. And there's many other examples. I'm just showing this one since it's fairly recent. This is a view where you see color on that map, where you see orange. It means there's a lot of smoke in the depth of the atmosphere. It's from July 13th of 2021. It was a large fire year in the western U.S. and in parts of Nebraska. The cost to deal with climate change impacts are going to go up. This is for the U.S. I should have pulled you can look at the Nebraska one specifically. I'm sorry, I didn't pull that one up. But it's got different types of disasters and how much, what's the financial cost of that. So we've got winter storm, freezes, fires, flooding, drought, severe storms, that's in green. So we're going from 1980, when we started keeping good records of these costs, and then going through 2021. This is adjusted for inflation. You can look at the unadjusted or the adjusted numbers. So however you look at it, these costs are going up. So this is a product not only of the events themselves, like droughts and floods and severe storms, but also a product of how vulnerable we are, choices we're making, where do we live and build. That also plays a role. So it is two factors here that are kind of tied together. But it's getting more difficult for people to afford insurance. So, think about if your income is a certain amount and you're choosing between, do I have rent? Can I pay rent? Do I have health care? Do I have food? Do I have insurance? This is something that will probably be off the table because if you have limited resources, this is going to impact those populations much more so. Well, and everybody in terms of the cost to insure their property. So I wanted to share some comments that are kind of anecdotal information. So I've given hundreds of talks to probably thousands of people over the last 7 years that I've served as state climatologist. And so in doing so, you get a good sense of what people understand and what some misconceptions are. I'm not saying that you all have these, I'm just saying that this is in general, we understand that we cycle. The climate system cycles naturally, which absolutely it does happen, and it impacts us. We feel that. But things are changing, and we seem to be having more extremes. They recognize that and they get it. They also get the fact that extreme weather impacts me personally. Drought impacts me, flood, tornadoes, all these things impact me personally. So that's pretty well understood. What's misunderstood there on the right is some people use the term weather and climate interchangeably, and they're not the same thing. So sometimes I say that weather is the clothes that we're wearing today, and climate is the clothes in our closet. So climate is the whole spectrum of weather events that we can experience. And the weather does vary from day to day. A climate change factor in it is, let's see that somebody comes in, takes all my clothes and replaces it with new ones. Okay? So that's kind of a climate change fact. Then, like, oh, wow, I'm missing this. I don't have this outfit. I don't have this weather event now because my climate has all shifted and things look different. Climate change already impacts me. Some people, and I'll show some actual data to help support this. Some people don't get that connection of climate change does impact me already. Some people also feel that changes I make personally don't matter in the bigger scheme of things. To me, that is not true at all. People see the choices that you make. It does have a much broader impact than what you may think. And again, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but some people feel that personal choices don't matter, but they absolutely do. All right, so I'll show a couple of images. Some of you may have seen these before. It's a really interesting project on climate communication and perceptions of climate change. So I'll show two graphics here. So you can see I've got a national map up. The colors on this are in the orange colors. That means a majority. Percent of adults who think global warming is happening. So what's your own personal belief or perception? Is climate change happening? So you see a lot of orange color on that map. So yes, about 72% is the national average. It's happening. We support regulation of CO2 as a pollutant. 75% of the US population thinks we need to regulate CO2 as a pollutant. So when you're speaking with policymakers, bring that point up. Your constituent, and it's the same for Nebraska, 75% of us feel that we should regulate it. We are worried about it, a majority is, and I'm just going through some of the other questions that are available in this survey. We feel it is harming us collectively. But we don't feel it is harming us personally. Less than a majority feels that it's harming us personally. So there's a disconnect. If you don't feel it's harming you personally, then you're less likely to change your behavior, do something about it. That's the image that you're seeing here. So anything in the blue is less than 45%. Another thing we don't do is talk about it. That number is even lower. It's about 35% in Nebraska talk about climate change. And I understand it can be a difficult thing to talk about. Trust me, I know. So, just a few comments on Nebraska's perceptions and how, a question in the back. Yeah.
Just a procedural question. Do you have some bills in the legislature that we're going to hear about?
So I don't outline specific bills. So in the end, I'll talk about a few issues that are related to bills.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to outline kind of three categories in Nebraska. So we've got this group of people is getting smaller and smaller. So the Climate Communications Project calls it dismissive. I call it harmful because these are people who are not making policy, not supporting policy to do something about climate change. And the size of the bubbles here are kind of relative. Then you've got which is probably one of the bigger bubbles in the state, is what I call the curious people. Maybe they were in the harmful category, but then something like the flood of 2019 happened, and then they felt an impact, and now they've moved over to, wait a minute, is this going to be happening more often? And then you've got, people like you, probably in the room, people who are actively engaged in the conversation and doing something about climate change or supporting legislation to mitigate future climate change. Okay, so given all of this, how do we move forward in this regard when it's a difficult subject to talk about? Two things that I think about. One is that the magnitude of changes going forward is going to be greater than what we've experienced in the past. So how we've dealt with things or policies that we've created in the past are not going to apply when it comes to mitigating future climate change. And secondly, think of this as an opportunity for transformational change. Just changing our mindset, providing a voice for the environment, for the underserved communities. This is going to be really critical, I think, for tackling both adaptation and mitigation. So this was legislation that was passed last year to provide an update to the 2014 climate report that came out. This one does include policy prescriptive measures that outline that for the state of Nebraska. So that's to be delivered to the governor's office next December. So I'm a part of that report update. I also wanted to bring your awareness, the University of Nebraska system is moving towards sustainability goals. So they've outlined things like how do we think about purchasing the built and natural environment? How do we think about that? Communication on this topic. Things like social justice issues as well are being thought of. So this whole view of sustainability at the system level. All right. So finally, and as you'll note, I'm choosing not to go through specific bills. There was quite a lot that was introduced in the legislature. But these are some things that I would look out for when it comes to supporting strategies that will promote climate mitigation and adaptation. So promotion of carbon-free energy. There are some bills that are related to renewables that we should be looking at and thinking about. We need to be getting off of fossil fuels and promoting more carbon-free energy. So anything that relates to that helps support that, whether it's construction or distribution of carbon-free energy, those we need to take a look at. Conservation of resources, whether it's in an agricultural sense or a municipal sense, then those should be considered. Thinking about food security, where is food available? Where do we purchase our food? Those kinds of strategies. Enhancement of water management. So, think about our climate as being more volatile. So the ability to capture water, store it somewhere, use it later, that's going to be even more important. Or policies that support different construction projects or just how we deal with water management. Those are going to be really critical going forward. Anything having to do with health capacity. So we talked about warming climate. That's going to impact people. It's going to impact animals, cattle production. If I was a confined feedlot operator, I would be really concerned about the viability going forward with warmer and drier summers. So building in that health infrastructure and capacity, at all levels and scales, I think is going to be really important. And then finally, something that some of you probably think about, but maybe not everybody does, is making sure that everybody has an equitable voice. All voices are heard, are at the table, and are respected. That is a direction that we have to go when it comes to solving the issue of climate change. To my knowledge, there are not any direct climate change legislation that is going through this, unless I've completely missed something. Yes?
Regarding your first bullet point, is there a bill that is opposite the motion of carbon-free energy, saying that public power districts should not buy renewable energy?
So the one that comes to mind is, there is one that is limiting where distribution and access for renewables can take place. So limiting kind of the physical space which renewables can occupy is one that I'm aware of in that regard. Yeah.
So they're fussy about wind
Um,
farms.
Let's see, where was I going? Yeah, I think I ended
Yes.
with this point here. So keep these social justice, environmental justice, keep these in mind. There are often ways that we can look at climate change that doesn't really state climate change policy. It's probably not going to state that. It's going to come at it from a different direction. So in looking at the bills, look for efforts that are going on in these specific areas. To my knowledge, those are the ones that are going through this session that will address climate change. Yeah.
So could we recommend or encourage people to go to the Sierra Club?
Yes,
They get very specific on policies and
Yes.
bills, right?
Yes, that is great. So I'm a university employee, so it is outside of my realm to, as an employee, I can as a private citizen, but as an employee, it's out of my realm to support or not support legislation. But there are advocacy groups, so think Marilyn? Carol, sorry. There are advocacy groups that I would strongly recommend that you reach out to, and they are looking into these issues in much more detail and will provide direction on where to go, as well as a strategy. If you wanted to go and testify, then you could be in contact with some of these organizations, like the Sierra Club was one that you mentioned.
Besides being addicted to oil, I think we're addicted to profits from oil. It seems like divestment is a policy that needs to be out
Yes.
there, but it's not happening.
It's not yet. I don't know that there is one currently. So that's being discussed at the university system level in terms of divestment. And that is one space where we can make significant impacts, is divestment from fossil fuels. So that would be another angle to support, work with maybe the group that you're involved with, or Sierra Club or something like that to support divestment. So that is where a big impact can be made.
Seems like there's been a couple ideas of bills to prohibit ESG considerations. I don't like that.
Yeah. Yes, and
Another source of information about bills related to climate, I think, is Interfaith Power and Light in Nebraska.
Yes.
Mr. Ken Winston is the lobbyist. He's the guy who runs that, and he's another source. I have a question for you. Your opening slide, I think, said that McCook, Nebraska has a climate mitigation plan. How many cities in Nebraska have already engaged in that or completed it?
So that image, I was involved in this project, and we worked with City of Lincoln, Grand Island, and McCook to develop city-specific reports that that synthesized climate projections for their local area. So City of Lincoln does have a climate action plan. Grand Island and McCook, I don't know where they are in that process. We also worked with cities across Kansas, Iowa, and Missouri as well in that process. The city of Omaha, that's in discussion. Some of you from Omaha may be more up to date on it than I. It's not in place, but that is being discussed. There's also activity taking place at the kind of multi-jurisdictional level for some of the natural resource districts. It's more in regard to drought planning, so that's kind of the angle that they are taking. So it's those three communities in Nebraska that I've worked with specifically, and there may be others that I'm not aware of, but I think there are some efforts locally for looking at climate projections and then making decisions based off of that. Like in the Parks and Rec Department, energy use. We worked with a city in Hays, Kansas that said, yeah, we had to turn away people because these projections are calling for drier and we can't support more growth. So that was something that they had mentioned to us.
What are those three communities in?
Lincoln, Grand Island, and McCook.
Before Rick has left his office, he started talking about the great big lake between Omaha and Lincoln. Is that anything to do with what our problem is here?
So the lake between Lincoln and Omaha, yeah, so that's an interesting one. I guess I almost see that as kind of an eastern Lake McConaughey, and I think there's multiple uses and interests to that. I did serve on the Lincoln Water 2.0, that council that looked at Lincoln's second water source, and it was discussed, that lake, that the city should at least think about, consider the viability of that reservoir if it should move forward. So yeah, that one, it's quite political, and so I'm trying to be really careful about how I talk about that one.
Yeah.
It's more for voting.
Yeah.
It's about as viable as the canal is from the South Platte up to the wildlife.
Yeah. Yes, 5 minutes left, okay. Yeah, so that one, yeah, that's a really unique one in that if Colorado, if we have enough water, then if we're in a wet period, then we're good. If we don't have the water, Colorado probably doesn't have it either.
They have less than we do.
Yeah, and right, so to me, they're already in significant issues, the interstate water issues out west. It doesn't make physical sense to look west in a hotter, drier climate. It doesn't make sense to go that direction, to me.
So, yeah, I was wondering about where does Masonet fit in this, and the follow-up question is the money that you are asking for, is that going to be enough to bring us to the leadership again?
Mm-hmm. So Masonet, I would say it almost touches a lot of these because there are many uses and applications that can be built off of weather information, and it's most useful, I think, for tracking current and emerging issues and understanding drought better and flood, used in a lot of agricultural applications. It is a significant boost to the budget, and having it sustained would be most helpful. An injection of resources is very good, but a sustainment of resources is much, much better, if that makes sense.
But does it bring us to the leadership?
I feel that if sustained, then it would, yes.
the mesonet, could you explain that, what it is?
So yes, the mesonet is a way that we observe weather conditions. So it's air temperature, relative humidity, wind speed and direction, barometric pressure, precipitation. We also have instrumentation below ground, so we're tracking soil temperature and soil moisture at 5 different depths in the soils. It is used by the National Weather Service. They actually buy it in real time to help with their watches and warnings and weather forecasts. When you see a U.S. drought monitor, there is mesonet information that is helping outline where we are in drought conditions and where we're not. When you see a flood outlook, it's used to help that. It's used to brief different agencies at the local and state level, like Nebraska Emergency Management, Nebraska Forest Service, thinking about wildfire potential. There's a big group of users. To me, a real value is that it's a local, trusted source of information.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, everyone.